All right, and this is how to feed an active starter, a normal, good, healthy starter to bake bread. So I will make this as a full story for the bread process, which I'll continue to build on today as we make a loaf of bread. So this bread's been sitting out overnight. It did get fed yesterday, so it's nice and healthy. I had it in the fridge for a while, so I fed it a couple times, and it's pretty happy. So I will go ahead and discard this. Let me tear out my scale. So I like to discard to 650 grams because of the weight of my jar and what I want. A little bit further. That's just what I use, my measurement. You'll have to find out what works for you based on how much starter you want to pull. I make 2 batches of bread typically because I gift my bread out to my friends. We do a lot of sharing on our food. A little bit more. Okay, right at 650, perfect. Love it when that happens. Okay, so my recipe that I will share later uses a 130 grams of starter. So I do double that. So I want to pull 260 grams of active starter for the bread that I'm gonna make. So that's why I have such a large amount of starter in here. So you don't need that much. As long as you have your weight of your jar, plus you want to build up to the 130 grams to pull from for a single loaf or 2 baguettes. And then enough that you aren't taking all of your starter out. You want to leave some of the discard or some of the starter left in there so you can build on it to make bread again. So I'd say another 150 grams to leave in there always. So if you were just doing a regular 1 loaf, I would say 130 plus 130, that's 260 plus the weight of your jar is what you'll want to build this to. So you could probably take it down to 130 plus the weight of your jar, because then you'll double that to feed it. So that's probably what I would do if I was you, if you're going to do one single one. So I will go ahead and feed it. So my 650 minus the weighted container, which I keep at 442, 450, and we'll take it down to about 200 grams. So I will feed it 200 grams. So 100 grams of that is flour. I'll put some of those notes in the comments to make sure it makes sense for you. I know some of the math gets a little confusing. I think it's easier to see it written down. So it's 100 grams. And then I'll add 100 grams of water. And remember, those weights are only because of the weight of my jar and how much I want to make. So your weights will be dependent on how much you want to make with it. 200 grams. Perfect. And then I will get my stirrer. Again, my chopstick works great. All right. And I should have a rubber band. I know I keep saying that. I'll grab one, but it's right about here. So when it's fully fed, and I'll come back later when it's fully fed. I don't know if you can see where it's at. It's kind of down in here. But when it's fully fed, it'll come up to about here. And that's when we know it's ready to use in food, in bread. And I will do the flow test, show you how to do that. And then we'll make a loaf of bread later. We'll come back in about 5 to 10 hours. Mine will take closer to 5 to 7, depending on the temperature and the region you live in. I would assume mine would be about probably close to 5 to 7 hours, yeah, for here. But I will let you know how long it takes here. And we'll come back later. Thanks. Okay, so the second part is I like to start my flour and water about a half an hour before I think the sourdough is totally active and ready to use. And I do that because flour takes a really long time to absorb into water. It takes a long time to absorb all the wet ingredients. So a half an hour is really good. It's kind of ideal, I think, for a good wheat flour. Rye flour, you don't want to let it set and autolyze like that as long. Like 10 minutes is good for rye, but just as a good rule of thumb, if you're doing all-purpose or bread flours with a higher protein for a higher chew, I think a good half hour is nice to use. So you don't have to do this. You're totally fine if you start fresh with the sourdough starter and your flour and water. But if you start earlier, it just makes it a little easier. It starts to be a little bit more foldable, like it's easier to work with. It's not quite as shaggy. So, oops. Start my flour. So I'm weighing this. So I do a double batch, but I'll give you the ingredients, the recipe I use for a single batch. So a single batch is 500 grams. So it's one bowl or 2 decent sized baguettes. I'm just doubling that for mine. I like to use this container that has a sealed lid so I can put it in the fridge. Because sourdough, you need to be ready when it's ready. And there are times you can take breaks and put it in the refrigerator because the entire act of making, raising the feeding it and getting it ready and all your stretch and folds and getting it raised is very lengthy. So if you're not able to put it in the fridge now and then, it really takes up a lot of time to get it right. So after it's got your bulk raised, you can refrigerate it for that at that point. All right, got my flour, and then I will add my water. So 500 grams of flour. So I do, I like a 70% hydration, which is like 350 grams, 350 to 375. Remember, mine's going to be bigger than yours because I'm doing a double batch. Okay. And again, I really like to use my chopstick because it makes it really easy to get to the bottom. It doesn't stick as much. So it looks really, really runny, doesn't it? It looks really like there's lots of water in here, but it doesn't take long for it to absorb, and it'll get really shaggy as long as you try to get it as moistened as possible. Scrape the bottom, get it moving. And again, you're just doing this to try to moisten as much flour as you can. If you're trying to hurry this up, you can use warmer water. I wouldn't recommend doing that very often, but if you're really trying to rush your process, you can do that. It will absorb a little bit faster and be ready to go. And my sourdough starter is getting close to doubled. It's never going to fully double. So I think the rule of thumb is if it gets to about 1.5 times, that's kind of when I start this process, which they call like autolyze. So it can kind of get ready. Water or the starter, you don't need to add it at this point. And salt actually makes your dough tighter. So you don't add the salt at this point. You just do your flour and water, and you can see it's just kind of a nice shaggy dough. So that's all I do at this point. And then this will sit for about 30 minutes. I will put the timer on for 30 minutes. And then when I come back, I will add my active starter. And when you say active starter, that means it's risen and that's full strength. And that's when you want to add it to your recipe because it's almost like an extra feeding. So it's at its full strength. Think of Popeye. And then you add it, you feed it again, and it's super happy, and it's going to get really big and strong. So I will be back later. Thank you. All right, it has been 30 minutes, and this dough is much more pliable, actually. It's nowhere near as shaggy, like I can grab it and do stuff with it. So I will put it on my scale. We are ready to feed with our sourdough starter. Is now about this high, so it's quite a bit. It's very active now. We call that active. So let me turn my scale on. And I do 15 grams of salt per batch. So again, I'm making a double batch today. So I put the salt right in first. I love using a scale to bake. Makes it so much easier. And lots of less dishes to wash. So I really like that. All right, so then my sourdough baby's here. Tear this out. So I do 130 grams of active starter, which is only active at this point when it's been fed and it's super happy and high. And so I'm going to double my batch, but teared out my scale. It's very close. And there, 260. Okay, so I'm just going to get this off of the rim so that it doesn't get thick. And so everything's just in there, lumped in there, and I'm going to start my first stretch and fold. I don't stir this in, I just do a stretch and fold over it, which some people stir it, and that's fine. But I guarantee if you do your stretch and folds enough, which you have to for, to get those long strands of sourdough, it will eventually fold enough. The first fold, if you see what I'm doing, it's very wet. So I'm grabbing underneath it, stretching it over this wet starter, which is fine. So you'll end up having a pocket of the wet starter in the center. But after the next fold or two, it's mixed in really well and it'll eventually go away. So you're basically wanting to grab it and pull it and stretch it over and press it down. And you're really not trying to rip it much. So you're really just trying to get those long strands. So you're forming gluten at this point. If you really don't like getting your hands super gooey, wet them first. So even just water on them makes a huge difference. And it's already starting to split. So I think we are good. So it doesn't look very cohesive and that's totally fine. So that's just my first stretch and fold. Most people do 20 to 30 minutes between stretch and folds. I do 30 minutes between the first two, and then I move to 20 minutes because it's still kind of absorbing and it takes a little bit more time for it to do that. So you're doing yourself a favor by autolyzing, by starting that flour and water before, doing that ahead of time lets it get nice and stretchy and hydrated, and then doing the longer stretches between the first two stretches makes the 30 minutes stretch and folds makes it a little bit more pliable too. So I'll come back in 30 minutes and we will do our second stretch and fold. All right, stretch and fold number 2. So now it's starting to combine a little bit. It's still going to be a little bit wet in the center, which is fine. So let me get my stretches on. See, it's pretty wet yet. And it's kind of splitting. You can see all the discard all the active starter I put in the center. There's some salty chunks at the bottom where it's starting to split a little bit. It's totally normal, totally fine. The salt kind of makes some of the bread a little bit stiffer as it's tightening the dough, but that will release eventually. So I won't get very many stretch and folds because you can see it's starting to get tight and rip. And so that's kind of when you stop, it just doesn't want to stretch much. And so that's really it. So it's not going to take long. Give it a little stretch and fold. Yep, and that is just about all I'm going to get. Man, not much at all. Still pretty tight. And we'll come back in another 30 minutes. All right, so this is the third stretch and fold. It's still pretty tight, but it's loosening up. You can kind of see that. Now you can get some nice long strands. Kind of looks like Play-Doh or taffy. It's kind of holding its shape a little bit better, but it's still pretty tight. Like that is about all I can get. And that is it. I'd call that pretty well good. And then at this point, I'm going to switch. Yeah, that's really, really tight. At this point, I'm going to switch to 20 minutes and we will start to see it get even more soft every time. Thanks. Okay, so this is stretch and fold number 4, and it is starting to come together a little bit better. So see, it's way stretchier. It's not breaking. I'm getting way more, like it's already not as tight as it was. So you really want like 5 to 7 stretch and folds. This is number 4, and it's starting to get tight already. See, it's about as far as I can go there. Scrape the bottom, keep it all together. Yeah, it's starting to get tight. Try to get just a little bit more in here. Yeah, it's probably good. And another 20 minutes. I think we can probably get, this is number 4. Probably get 2 or 3. See how many more I want to do. That's good for now. Okay, this is stretch and fold 5. See how much stretchier it is? Way better stretches. It's getting really cohesive. It's like kind of like a nice Play-Doh, nice and stretchy. This will make really nice long strands within the sourdough when it's baking. So 5 stretches, you could pretty much stop. I've done this before and had very successful good bread. But I will go to 7 just because you can get a little bit better. And it's already tight. So I'd like to get it to where I can get several stretch and folds without it starting to rip or getting super tight. So another 20 minutes. Okay, stretch and fold number 6. We're very close here. And it's super stretchy. Very happy, nice and mixed. Very close. I still think I'm going to do one more. Stick with the 7. Make sure you don't have anything stuck to the bottom. Get as many stretch and folds as you can. It's starting to get tight. I think that's about it. Yeah, see, it doesn't really want to do much more. And that'll do. All right, one more 20-minute thing, and then we'll do our last one. Okay, and it is the 7th stretch and fold, and it is 9:30 here, so that's perfect timing because after this last one, I can let it sit overnight. So it can sit overnight about 7 really 9 to 11 hours, depending on how cold it is outside. So if it's really hot, you might want to make sure it's really late before you do the final stretch and fold, kind of like playing your time out. So I fed mine. I always try to feed mine around lunchtime so that I can do my start the stretch and folds and mixing it around like dinner time. And so that by the time I'm done with all the stretch and folds, I can go to bed and I can leave out overnight. Otherwise, in the middle of the night, one of us has to put it in the fridge. It's generally not me because I have a very supportive spouse. So anyway, the last stretch and fold, it looks really good. The bottom of the bowl is nice and smooth, and we will get this nice and rounded, kind of flip it over. Don't know really that's important, but I always do. Make it look nice and cohesive. And that's your little bread bowl. So remember, this is a double batch, so yours isn't going to look as big. And then I always just get the seal on here. Just kind of give it a little gassing. So like I said, this will sit overnight outside, so it can sit out for about 7 to 11 hours, depending on the temperature. So this will be fine here. It's a little bit cooler here, so it'll be okay overnight. And then instead of trying to get it prepped and shaped and ready for bread in the morning, I tend to throw it in the fridge first thing in the morning, so I can work with it whenever it works with my schedule. So that's what we'll do. But it does have to do its bulk raising at room temperature. So you can't just put it in the fridge right now. So you really want to leave it out for a while. And as long as it's cool enough, you could probably leave it out overnight, just depending on the time. So we will throw this in the fridge in the first thing in the morning, and I will come restart this tomorrow when I've got a chance to work with it. Now you'll need about 1 to 3 hours And the next step to get it shaped and raised and ready to bake, depending again on the temperature. So make sure you've got enough time at home to be able to do that. All right. Okay, so this is close to 24 hours since I put this, since we did our final stretch and fold, and you can kind of tell it's ready, bulk rising, because you see these little bubbles that kind of shows you that there's a little bit of surface bubbles, and it's finished with that bulk rise. It's gotten a lot bigger than when we put it in here last. So we did get this back put in the fridge about 6 a.m. this morning, and it's about 6 p.m. now, and I finally have time to work with it and get it prepped. But remember, I made a double batch, so I'm only going to take half of this out because you do not need to, this can actually stay in the fridge for up to 3 days, and it will get stronger in flavor and actually a little bit better. So I like to leave it in the fridge if I can, but we are pretty much out of bread. So I'm gonna go ahead and make 2 baguettes tonight and then put the rest of this back in the fridge, and I can work with it later on this week, within the next couple of days. So I'm just gonna cut half of this with my bench scraper and plop this back into my container. And it's got a nice sealed lid, so it will be completely fine in the fridge for the next 2 days, and it will not dry out. So you can do that if you put it in like a zip bag or a sealed lid. I'll put this back in the fridge and it'll be fine. So this last 2 ones, I really like to do, I used to try to do 3 baguettes, but they end up being kind of small with the one recipe. So I'm going to cut these in half because I really like the size of just the 2 of them. And if you had your dough refrigerated, it's going to be a little bit cool, so it'll be a little bit stiffer to the touch, which is fine. So sometimes you want to let it set out just a little bit so that it kind of comes to room temperature and gets a little bit easier to work. But I kind of just pull it into kind of a rectangle shape. You don't want to rip the dough, so try not to do that. You worked on getting all those good stretch and folds, those nice long fibers in the dough, the gluten strands, so you don't really want to kill those. But I kind of just get it into a nice big rectangle, and lots of people have lots of fancy techniques on how they think that how they fold the dough together. Some people do like an envelope, and some people do like, then they kind of pinch it as they go down, working it across the dough. I kind of do a little bit of an envelope. I just take the 2 sides, I fold them in, and then I fold it, turn it back on itself. So we'll do that here. They're roughly the right shape. I probably could let this sit just a little longer to get softer and loosen, but it should be fine. So here and there, some people still get the ends tucked in, and sometimes I'll do that too and kind of just tuck these 2 ends in and then pull it towards me to create a nice little loaf shape. So I will do that as well. Tuck these little ends so that you don't get the ends sticking out. And you can tell that the dough's already starting to get kind of tough. So there's a technique where you kind of like pull underneath it towards you. So that creates this tension across the surface where you're kind of pulling and tucking that roll. So I'm going to do that here too. You know, again, you don't want to rip the surface. So if you start seeing it get real tight across the top, which you want, and if it looks like it's going to split and tear, you don't want to do that. So you want those nice tight surfaces. This side's getting a little thin, so I'm going to kind of tuck him in as I'm working him into a good shape. And actually, these are pretty good. Sometimes it's better if you just like let it sit for about 5 minutes and come back to it. So I'm going to let it sit for just a minute while I show you one little trick that I do. I use a gluten-free flour. Let me show you what this is. This is my couche. This is just like a linen towel. But over time, you can use flour on it. You really don't wash it ever, but you shake it out and keep it sealed in a sealed Ziploc so that you can't get any bugs or anything into it. And you shake it out real good so there's no like excess flour sitting on it. Sometimes the flour gets kind of chunky from the moisture, but it lets it shake it out and gets all those chunky pieces off of it. So I do kind of prop it up against something, and then you can make your shapes for your baguettes here. So you can see I've got these two long troughs here, and you're going to want to heavily flour this. Any moisture in your baguette, and you want your baguettes to be nice and moist in the center, but any moisture in them is going to leach into the towel. And then when you lift it off, it'll stick and embed in the towel. So you want it really heavily floured so that it doesn't do that. Then remember, you can shake off excess flour before you bake it or whatever afterwards. But my little trick here is I keep a container of gluten-free flour. You don't have to do this, but the gluten-free flour will not react more gluten in the bread. So it's not going to have as much of a reaction in turning the flour that touches the bread into more glutinous mass. So there's less risk of it embedding into the flour. So I will go ahead and do that. I get a little extra flour here on the couche. You can pick these up on Amazon. I didn't have one to start with, so if you don't have a couche and you don't want to purchase one, you can use a towel to get the folds and kind of help support the bread. There's metal shapes that you can hold. You're just keeping the shape of the baguette while it's going through the final rising stage. That's the only purpose of it. So if you use a towel, you'll want to line it in something. You can just use a regular towel and heavily flour it. You'd want to really heavily flour it because there could be risk of it, especially with a regular towel having the little knobs and things of string. But if you flour it, or if you line it with parchment paper and heavily flour it, obviously you can't bake it with the towel. So you would have to then pull everything off of that to bake it. So you could either remove it off of the towel at that phase and bake it with the parchment paper, or you can just pop it off onto your arm or onto a baking sheet. Sometimes I'll use like a flat sheet or a cutting board to roll the dough onto and then put it onto your baking sheet. So I'll show you that to you later when these are finished raising. So since we got this prepped, let me see if the dough has loosened up at all. And it has. So I'm just going to give it a little extra tuck here. Get a little bit more size out of it. And you can always tell that the texture of it, see, this is pretty stiff. It doesn't want to stretch at all because it's a little cold. But I think the size is actually going to be pretty good. So I'm not going to wait around. If you're really picky about your size or your shape of your baguettes, you can absolutely take more time on it. Getting it very even across the whole baguette. But you know, when you're making baguettes multiple times of the week, you get a little less picky. All right, a lot of people do roll these in a flour first. It's quicker to me to just lay them right in the couche and then, just over flour the couche. So that's basically what I do. So I think you can see the two baguettes just laying in here. And I do kind of cover them. I don't really know that you need to, but I kind of do. So they're just laying, let me see if you can see that a little bit better. Yeah, the baguette's laying in the couche. And I will let these raise for about an hour, 1 to 3 hours. It is a little cooler in our house, so it'll probably be closer to 3 hours for us. And we will come back later. Thank you. Okay, so this is the last step. We're going to go ahead and make our bread. And it only took me about an hour and a half for this last raise. And I think that's because the temp in the house is a little bit warmer because we've been cooking in here and getting dinner going and everything. So it was a little bit quicker. How do you know when your bread is ready to bake, whether it's a bowl or the baguettes? You'll want to do like an indent test. So you kind of, you do a little poke test. And if the bread bounces back immediately, it's not done. Because it's not going to double like regular yeast bread. It gets close, but it doesn't really fully double. The rest of your rise happens in the oven with oven spring. And oven spring, I think, is like 35% of the size of the loaf you should get or could get with oven spring, something like that. This is a lame. You can get these pretty cheap anywhere. It's just a razor blade. You have to be very careful with it, obviously, and changing them out. I'm super careful on those because, that's when you really could get hurt. But you really want to make your cuts want to be almost vertical. So you're kind of at a good angle like this, kind of tilted over about as vertical as you can, and you make nice quick slits in the bread. I find I don't always make a thick enough slit, so sometimes I'll go back and kind of deepen them up a little bit, but you want to make sure you get nice clean cuts. You don't want jagged cuts because they won't make as pretty of a loaf, which maybe isn't important to you. But I always notice that if your bread, when it's puffing up, sometimes I'll get like blowouts on the side where the bread is trying to expand. The oven spring is trying to get so big so quick that the sides will kind of blow out and kind of get puffy. And that's what tells me I think I need more slits for steam to escape. So then it expands in the space of your slits, and instead of blowing out the side. The other thing is when you're making your slits, you're so tempted to make slits like this in a baguette, like an angle. But honestly, when it cooks, those angles will turn like that. So you want to make your slits almost as up and down along the length of the baguette as possible, with just a slight, a slight deviation, like 5 to 15% of a deviation, overlap to each other. And then they will look more like a normal diagonal that you're used to seeing on a baguette. So little tricks you can play around with. I'm never excellent at it. They're never super repeatable and perfect, but that's what I tend to do. So I do bake this at 500 degrees. You want to get your oven as hot as possible. If you have a commercial oven, you would want to use some steam, and the steam gives that really gorgeous crackle crust on a baguette. So that's where you get that kind of blistered crust where it's really nice and bubbly. I love that crust on a baguette. You'll get a nice, good, crisp crust, but just not as much as with the steam. So I've seen people will put some ice cubes around the pan if they do the bowl, like around your parchment paper in the Dutch oven. And in the baguettes, I've seen people put a tray underneath the baguette with ice in that or boiling water, and that will cause steam as well. So those are just different options you can use. So one method to get these onto the pan is to, you can turn it onto your arm and flop it on. And sometimes I do that. But if my sleeves are really hard to pull up, then it's not always an option. So anyway, I'm going to pull this apart. And I think you can kind of see the baguettes. Oops. They're very soft and fluffy, apparently. And what I'm going to use is a cutting board, because it's something everybody has at home, which is just a nice big cutting board. And I'll flop it, turn it, roll it onto this cutting board. I'm gonna get rid of some of this excess flour, just because you don't need it. Plop it onto the cutting board. I should have floured the cutting board. So that's a nice tip for you all. Learn from me. So I will do this one this way. I did also give this one a little spray of avocado oil, and I use that instead of olive oil because olive oil has such a low heat smoke temperature, And it also can mess up your pans. It can make them kind of stained. So if you care about that, then you might want to be careful. Your couche, if you use a couche, you leave it out until it's 100% dry, because there's a lot of little kind of wet spots on the couche. I don't know if you can see that. It's just kind of the moisture has soaked into it. And if I put that in the bag now and sealed it up, it would get moldy. So I will wait that, and I'll open this back up to let it dry fully. And then I will let it dry fully and then put it back, shake it out real good, and then put it in the bag. So hopefully this angle helps a little bit. So I've got my angle with my corner, and I will try to make some nice quick cuts. They're not great, they're okay. I will go in and deepen some of these now that I got the surface cut. I'm sure there's people online that say that's not the right way to do it. That is probably very fine, but I get some very nice baguettes out of this, and none of my friends have ever complained. So there's that. All right, so I'm gonna give you a little close-up for this, and then I will pop it in the oven. See my deep cuts, and they're very deep, which would make you think they're maybe too deep, but we'll see. So I will bake this at 500 for about 8 minutes, and then I will lower the temperature to about 450, then for another maybe 8 minutes until I get the darkness that I want. And I don't go super dark so that I can toast it more later. I also like them a little bit softer inside. I like the outside to be nice and crisp, a little softer inside. So play with it and see how much you like. And I will come back for the last one. Okay, so true to form, I had one of these baguettes, did have a major blowout. So, and it was on the thin end too, so I'm really kind of surprised. Oh no, still, I'm very surprised. So anyway, let me show you what these babies look like. One of them looks quite lovely. One of them looks quite lovely. This guy here, this lovely, the slits look nice and sideways, and look at nice little blowout. So anyway, not perfect, but nice crust on both of them. Nice and crunchy. So I will come back in just a little while to do a very last follow-up and show you the cutting into it and how delicious they are with some butter. So note to self, continue to cut a very deep line in my baguette. All right, so we're going to try this angle for the cutting. You can see the baguette has a nice crust, and we will cut this guy. It's still kind of nice and soft. There's a good crust there, but it's still nice and really soft inside. And you can see that. And some nice air bubbles, and there you go. This makes nice little garlic toast or bread for your soup, or you can cut it this way and have nice baguette sandwiches. All excellent choices. Thank you.